Creature capturing coders, it's Professor Gallagher, and in this lesson we're going to use our Poke API to get page after page of Pokemon as we scroll. Once we're looking at the last Pokemon that we've downloaded, if there are more creatures available, we'll load the next page of 20, and we'll do that until we've caught them all. Ready to learn big? Let us continue to hack. So we've got this nice list of Pokemon that we've downloaded as our first page of JSON, and if we click on a Pokemon, we see some details on that creature and a creature image. Now, before we download our next page of Pokemon, one thing that would be nice is if we numbered our Pokemon so that we can tell how many we have loaded so far. So I'd like to modify the string we're using in our navigation links label and add a number in front of it. Unfortunately, we're iterating through an array, and when we do this, we don't have an index value. So we have our creatures array here, and each individual element is a creature, but we don't have any sort of count or index value. Well, we can actually change this, and instead we can iterate through a range instead of iterating on an array, and we can use that range as the index number for each of our Pokemon. I'm going to do that just after the open parenthesis for the list here, where I say 0 ... less than symbol, so that's our half open range. We have to use a half open range here in a SwiftUI list, and remember how half open ranges work. We go up to, but we never reach a value. So here we also need this to be a number. We're going to say creatures.creatureArray.count. So this will go from 0 up to, but never reach the total number of creatures in the creature array, which is one less than that, which is exactly what we want because we're 0 indexed. Now, since our list is going through a range, we're going to have an integer in here. Why don't we call that index? So we're going to replace our creature value with index in, and I'm going to highlight and copy creatures.creatureArray up here, and I'm going to paste that over my detail view where we're passing in the creature, but I'll follow this with open and close square bracket and put index inside. We're still passing over a creature, whatever value we click on, but this time we're accessing it using an index value instead of the constant creature that we were using when we iterated through the array. Then I'm going to highlight this whole statement here, creatures.creatureArray bracket index close bracket, and I'm going to copy it and paste it over top of creature in my text view down below. Now we see this is showing our names of the creatures in our preview, which is what we want, but we also want to put the index value +1 in front of this. So let's embed this whole value here in a string, and here's a pro tip. If I make a selection in Xcode, and then I type the first value of something that comes in pairs, in this case a double quote, Xcode puts the double quote out front and adds a double quote at the end of my selection. Now I want this to be inside of a string interp, so I'm going to type an open parens. Xcode adds the close parens at the end of the selection. Then I'll add a backslash in between the double quote and the open paren. And then in front of this, still inside the string, I'm going to say string interp dot space. And inside of the string interp, I'm going to say index +1. And look at that. That's exactly what I want. Our Pokemon are numbered 1 through 20. Cool. Now, before we get our next page of Pokemon, let's also add a toolbar at the bottom that will show how many creatures we've downloaded and how many total creatures we have. And we can do this really easily. So I'm going to do this as another modifier for the list just after our navigation title. I'll collapse the list so that's easier to see. Here I'll say .toolbar, select the option with just content, press return for the trailing closure format, then enter a toolbar item view, select the option with the placement and the content, and for placement we've got a few options in here. First I'm going to type in .bottom bar. Code completion says this places the item in the bottom toolbar, then tab over to content, press return for trailing closure, and in between the curlies I'm going to enter a text view. No button or anything like that. I just want a status message down below. And for the string inside the text view, between double quotes, I'm going to pass in string interp of string interp creatures. And in the first string interp, I'll say creatures.creatureArray.count. So that'll tell me how many creatures I've downloaded. And in the second string interp, I'll enter creatures.count. This is the number we got from our API call. We parsed that out of the JSON, and it's the total number of Pokemon that are available. So at the time that I'm recording this video, that number is 1,302. So let's take a look over here on the right, and look at that! We can see we've downloaded 20 of 1,302 Pokemon. Excellent! And while I set the placement as bottom bar, a better place for this kind of text view is in status. So I'm going to replace bottom bar with dot status. It looks the same, but it would vary if we added some buttons in the bottom bar as well. And in fact, if we read in code completion, we see code completion says the item represents a change in the status for the current context. And that's actually what we're getting in here. The status is changing as we load more and more Pokemon. So now it's time to load up our next page of Pokemon. Well, how are we going to do that? Well, if we scroll and we end up looking at the very last Pokemon in our creatures array, then we want to go ahead and download the next page of Pokemon if another page is available. Now remember, if we're looking at our JSON, this key here named next has the URL for the next page of 20 Pokemon. When do we want to get our next page of Pokemon? Well, if we've loaded and we're looking at the last element in the creatures array, that would be creatures.creaturesarray.last. That'll get the last element. So when the element of the array appears and we see this last element, then we're ready to call getData again, and we do that using the next value, which is the URL of the next page of 20 Pokemon. So here's where we've used the URL in next to load the second page of data. See how this next page starts with Spearow, and then if we scroll down to the last Pokemon in this page, then we call getData using the next URL on this page. This loads the next page of creatures that starts with Zubat. Scroll to the end of this next 20, and then when we hit that last creature, we call getData again. We load the next page of Pokemon using this URL. That'll give us a page that starts with Poliwhirl, and we do this over and over again until we've loaded all the pages. Now, one thing to remember is when we wrote getData, we actually updated the URL string with the next value that's on the current page of Pokemon. Remember that URL string? This is what we use to turn into a URL value, and we use this to call the URL session. So we've already got the next value in URL string, so all we need to do is call getData. Now there's also one really important thing to remember. We need to update this creatures array by adding the new results array to the end of the current creatures array. If we don't do that, we don't make this change, then we just replace one page with another. I've seen lots of students forget to do this update, and they're wondering why they're not showing all of their data in their app. So cool, this seems like it'll work. Now we keep calling getData each time we look at the last element in our creatures array, but when do we know we don't have any more data left? Well, if you were to click away at the URL in next for page after page, this would actually be the second to last page of data that's available. And this one right here would be the last page. And do you see what we have in the next value on this last page? It's not a valid URL. It's null. And we said in an earlier lesson that null is JSON speak for nil, or an absence of value. Now we are going to run into an issue when we hit null on this very last page. And that's because our JSON is expecting to decode a string, not a null. So I mentioned in the last lesson, we should have set our string for the next value here to an optional string, not just a string. But I didn't make that change right away because I want you to see the error. It's really common to encounter this when you decode JSON and you don't realize that you might get a null value instead of a value that you're expecting. So we'll show that error at the end of the lesson and we'll show you how to fix it. But for now, let's see how we can code up our app to load page after page of data as we scroll. First, we know we can use the task modifier to fire when a view appears and to run asynchronous code. The asynchronous part is important because getData is an asynchronous function. But there's one tricky aspect to using this in SwiftUI. We can't use this on a navigation link inside of a list. Task in a list won't fire when we see one element at a time. But there is a way around this. If we put a lazy V stack inside the list and around our navigation link, then when we call task on a lazy V stack, since the lazy V stack only loads rows one at a time when it needs them, then we can be sure when we call task, we're actually calling it when the row we're looking at has appeared on screen. So the first thing that we'll do is add a lazy V stack around our navigation link like this. Then we'll add a task modifier below the lazy V stack, and inside task, we're going to look at the last element in our creatures array. That's this value last creature that we're creating with this guard statement. Now, once we have the last creature in the array, we're going to compare it to the current array element that we're looking at, which is this value here, creatures.creaturesArray at index. And we actually compare the .name properties of these two values since each Pokemon has a unique name. So if they're equal, then we know we're looking at the same thing. So if that's true, that means that the Pokemon that loaded at the index value of index is also the last creature in the creatures array. So that means we're looking at the last creature that we loaded, so we should call getData and load more JSON. But we only want to do this if the URL string has a valid URL, not if it's null, remember? Because if it's null, that means there are no more pages of Pokemon left to load. We've loaded the last page of JSON. So here I check to see if the URL string begins with, or has a prefix of, HTTP. That wouldn't be the case if we get a null value for the next value. So if this is no longer true, then we must be looking at the last page of JSON data, so this will make sure that we never call getData if we have no more pages of data left, and we're done. So let's code this up and see if it works. So in our creatures list view, first let's embed the navigation link in a lazy V stack. So I'm going to right click on the navigation link to pull up the quick action menu, and there's no embed in lazy V stack, but I'll just select embed in V stack, and then I'll add the word lazy out front. Now in live preview, this doesn't seem to change the way the app executes at all, but it will let us detect when one row at a time appears. So we do this so that we can properly leverage the .task modifier, and we're going to add that just below lazy VStack. You can see I code folded my lazy VStack so I can find where we want to add this below it. So I'll say .task and add curlies, and in between the curlies, we're going to check to see if we've loaded the last element in the creatures array. So I'll first use a guard let statement to get the last element in the creatures array. And I'll do that with guard let, we'll call this last creature, equals creatures.creaturesArray.last else, and in between curlies return. And remember, we used guard let because last might return a nil. If I option click on top of that, we can see element question mark to indicate that last could give us a nil. But if we get past the guard statement, we know that we've got the last element of our creatures array. And this is where we compare that to see if it's the same as the last creature that we loaded in our lazy VStack. So we'll do that with if creatures.creatureArray, bracket index bracket, and we're going to compare names. So I'm going to add .name to the end of this. Then we'll say equals equals to compare this to last creature.name. That's the last creature in our creatures array that we got in this line above. Now, not only do we want to make sure this is true before we load more data, but we also want to create a compound conditional. We also need to check to make sure that we've got a page of data to load. So we're going to say ampersand, ampersand. That creates an and for a compound conditional. Two things need to be true. And we're going to check to see if creatures.url string .has prefix, and then we're going to pass in the string HTTP open and close curlies. So if both these things are true, then we should call getData. That's the same call that we made down here inside of our first or outermost task modifier that shows up when the view first loads. So I'm going to copy this line out here. It's got the await out front, which is what we want. And I'm going to paste that inside of this new task modifier, which applies to the lazy VStack. But there are a couple of things we need to address first, and one of them is that mistake that I mentioned that I've seen lots of students make in the past and that I also make too sometimes. We need to make one modification in our getData function call in our creatures view model. So let's head over there, and inside our getData method, find the do clause. And you see this line here where we say self.creaturesArray equals return.results. Well, this will stamp over anything in self.creaturesArray with the results we've just returned. And we don't want to replace creaturesArray with the new returned results. We want to add the returned results to the creaturesArray. So we just say self.creaturesArray equals self.creaturesArray plus return.results. Then we can head back to creatures list view. It's almost going to work correctly. If I hold my mouse down and scroll, I actually don't see the next page load. Now it's actually loading, but the fact that I have my mouse down is taking precedence over the loading and updating of the pages that's happening behind the scenes. There's another way I can encounter this error. So if I click on the live preview button again and I'll restart the execution of this app, I can swipe up rapidly and I can see I'm loading page after page after page. That looks good. My status update down below is also updating, but at some point I'm going to run into a wall. For me, that happened around 140. Let me show you what's going on and how we can fix that. So to describe what's going on, let's head over to our creatures class. Now down here when we get data, we actually might be performing these tasks where we update these variables after that scroll takes place. Now if that happens, these values aren't going to be updated in a way that compares what's in our interface with the data that's loaded. That might be hard to figure out, so let me describe things this way. We might have scrolled to the last element in the array in the user interface before the data has loaded, and this would be bad because we're checking to see if the element that we scrolled to is the last element that loaded. So if we scroll to the last element in the array before our code recognizes that there are more elements in the array that have loaded, then our app won't go any further. It'll seem like it froze, and here's why that happens. Well, the Swift language on Apple devices can run on what are called multiple threads. You can think of threads as being like lanes in a highway. The main thread is sort of like the fastest lane in the highway, and Apple insists that all code that controls the user interface run in the main thread, the fast lane, so things don't look slow and the user always has an optimal experience. Why would you even want a slow lane? Well, sometimes there are things that don't need to be that fast, like accessing data on the internet, for example. Now, when we call getData from our creatures object, it's possible that that call is happening outside of the main thread in the slow lane. And if we're allowed to check the last element that we scrolled to before the data is loaded, then we're not really checking to see if the last element scrolled to is the last element in our array, because we haven't loaded the last element in the array yet. So what we can do is we can force the updating of variables after they get data to occur in the fast lane, the main thread. And if this happens, we'll make sure that the array in our list view gets updated with the latest data, and we can keep scrolling, so we'll eventually be able to load more data when we get to the end of the last data that's loaded. Now, and frankly, I'm still wrapping my head around some of the changes that have occurred with the last version of Xcode and iOS 18 and the observable macro that happened the year before. Now, before the observable macro, we used to be able to add @main_actor to the top of the class. Everything inside would execute on the main thread, no problem. Also, Xcode would give us a sort of purple warning. It would highlight code in purple if there was going to be something that impacted the user interface that might not execute on the main thread. So Xcode used to catch problems for us. It doesn't do that anymore. Now, dealing with the problems isn't too difficult. There are a bunch of different ways we can do this, but the way that I'm going to show you here is to simply wrap any updating of values that might impact the user interface in a task that's pushed to the main thread. And here's how we do it. So down here in the do clause, in the do catch statement that's in our get data function, just before we update our class properties, I'm going to say task with a capital T, open and close curlies, and after the opening curly on the same line as task, I'm going to say @main_actor, and follow that with the keyword in, lowercase. Main actor is one word, upper camel case, and then we'll cut out the three variables, paste them inside the curlies of the main actor task, and this is going to force that update to be on the main thread. We're never going to face a situation now where we've scrolled to the end, but we don't recheck the scroll after the new data has been loaded. So a good rule of thumb is if you've got a function in a class that's updating any data that should impact the user interface, that's usually any public class properties, when you update those values, just wrap them in a task that's set on the main actor. So let's see how things work. We can head back to the creatures list view. And the problem we had before, if I hold down my mouse button and scroll slowly, we can see that we're still updating pages. So I've increased to 40 creatures and other pages loaded. And I can continue to scroll up super fast, and we can see page after page after page is loading. Now I could go all the way to the end, but I want to show you an error that's going to happen at the very last page that loads. And in order to do that, why don't we go ahead and build and run. So click on the play button. And remember, our getData function prints out our URL string every time we go ahead and access new data. So if I scroll up past 20 values, then we can see another page is loading. If I scroll up again, I see another URL printout down below. That's for the third page that loads. And now I'm going to scroll and scroll and scroll really fast. We can see that new URLs are printing down below. There's one URL for each new page that's loading. But watch what happens when I get to the very last page. And here we go. Oh, we get JSON error, could not decode return JSON data. Let's see why. And I warned you about this problem in an earlier lesson. First, remember the reason why we're printing out the URLs to the console. This will help us put on our Deerstalker hat and Sherlock out the issue. So I'm going to highlight and copy this very last URL that we accessed. This is the URL where we got the JSON error. Then head over to the web, paste this URL in, and ding dang, will you look at that? The next value is null, and we know null is the JSON equivalent of Swift's nil. Now if we head back to our creatures class, we can see we access that data in this return struct up here. And oh yeah, that next value is set to be a string, and I even put in a to-do in here that says we want to change this to an optional. How come? Because in the very last page, we don't have a next page because we've loaded all of our Pokemon pages. We can see we've got a null. Swift will decode that as a nil, and a nil cannot fit into a string. That's why we get the JSON error. If you ever see JSON errors like this, that happens when we try to decode JSON data into a set of Swift structures and properties that aren't set up to hold the JSON that we're getting back. So the problem here is our returned structure, that doesn't match the JSON we're getting. Now, sometimes an API documentation will clearly state this. Other times, this might just not show up until you go ahead and do some user testing. But fortunately, the fix for this is pretty easy. All we need to do is put a question mark after string. This will allow us to get back not just strings, but also null values. But we need to remember now we're putting this inside of an optional value. So down here where we set returned.next to self.url string, we'll use nil coalescing with question mark, and I'll put an empty string after this. That means if we can safely unwrap return.next into a string, we'll put the string in URL string, but if we get a nil value, we'll just put an empty string into URL string. Either way, since our returned.next property is now an optional string, we're not going to get the JSON decoding error. So I'll speed ahead and launch the app in the simulator, and I'm scrolling and scrolling until I hit the last page. I'll speed things up for you, and here I am about to scroll to that last page, and we should now not see a JSON error in the console, and we should see the last page of Pokemon loading, and there we have it. 1302 of 1302 creatures loaded, no errors, and this last guy here is Terrapagos Stellar. Apologize to the Poke fans if I pronounce this wrong. Confession, I'm actually not that into Pokemon myself, but I've got 3 kids, so through osmosis, I've learned about this stuff. I've watched my fair share of TV shows. So, this is fantastic, Swifter. You've gained a pretty significant skill loading and decoding JSON page after page as you scroll. And hopefully you also feel good about learning additional tips like detecting and diagnosing JSON errors and how to fix them. Now, if you click on some of those later Pokemon, you might see that you don't see an image showing up for them. That's because those particular Pokemon don't use the front default URL that we grabbed in our prior lesson. Some have the image in another location, others don't have any image at all, but we'll learn how to fix this in a future lesson. For now, bask in the Swiftacular skills that you've acquired, and do me a solid, like and subscribe, tell your friends, classmates, and professors about this YouTube series. Everyone is welcome to use my content in their classes, but I want to hear from folks that find this useful. More lessons coming up next. Continue to hack.